Perhaps one of the names most synonymous with refugee film is Ai Weiwei and his film Human Flow. The film follows a range of refugee stories around the world as groups of people attempt to cross borders, complete difficult journeys, or often simply wait in limbo. Through the people he interviews and portrays, Ai seeks to humanize refugees and show audiences the global proportions of these humanitarian disasters. While Ai has garnered a reputation as a relatively groundbreaking artist, the way he depicts himself in his films is fraught in many respects. At times, Human Flow can feel exploitative of its refugee subjects and center too heavily on the personality or brand of the filmmaker himself. Two texts in particular provide helpful analysis on Ai as a filmmaker and the role he plays in his films. Katarzyna Marciniak's Opening a Certain Poetic Space, What Can Art Do for Refugees? And Susan Sontag's Regarding the Pain of Others. Marciniak looks at the ethics surrounding refugee film and the role art can play in the lives of refugees themselves. She assesses the limitations that exist in representing refugee experiences. In a different vein, Sontag charts the history of representing pain and violence across visual media, looking at how these depictions shape both the minds of the viewer and often the lives of the viewed. Her work ties in the issue of authenticity in regards to the documentation of traumatic or violent events. Ultimately, Ai Weiwei's documentary style is detrimental to the message Human Flow is able to communicate, and makes his work feel less than authentic as a viewer. The film presents an almost romanticized image of the struggles refugees face, packaged in the identity of the artist. What this film demonstrates is the true challenge of creating compelling and ethical refugee art, and leaves one with doubt as to whether or not refugee experiences should or can be properly represented through art at all. In her essay, Marciniak approaches the limitations and ethics surrounding refugee art from an intentionally ambiguous perspective. She doesn't take one side in the discussion surrounding who is qualified to tell refugee stories and what kinds of representation are productive or exploitative. Instead, the author offers contrasting perspectives on several pieces directly related to refugee experiences, including Human Flow. She asks what makes refugee art authentic or not, and how the inherent messiness of art makes this question difficult to answer in any definitive way. Susan Sontag, on the other hand, doesn't comment much at all on refugees in particular, but rather on the history of representation and spectatorship of other suffering. Her argument centers primarily around the origins of war photography. These documentary traditions, however, have carried through the inception of film and are clearly visible in Ai's work. Ai's presence in the documentary is clear from the very first scene of the film. We see a boat loaded with people in life vests approaching the shore. As the presumed refugees begin to make their landing, we cut to Ai, laying in a ditch with his camera in hand. This shot only lasts mere seconds, but it speaks volumes to the position Ai takes as the artist in his films. While we are being introduced to the subject of the film, refugees, we are also shown the secondary subject, Ai himself. The gravity of what we are seeing unfold and the completion of a leg of an arduous journey that is not yet over for these refugees is undermined by the presence of Ai in the frame. Our attention is drawn away from those who seem to require it, and directed towards Ai. Sontag writes, in a system based on the maximal reproduction and diffusion of images, witnessing requires the creation of star witnesses, renowned for their bravery and zeal in procuring important, disturbing photographs. One of the first issues of Picture Post, which ran a portfolio of Capa's Spanish Civil War pictures, used as its cover a headshot of the handsome photographer in profile, holding a camera to his face. The greatest war photographer in the world, Robert Capa. Ai Weiwei is in many ways like these iconic war photographers, but his battlefield of choice has been the borders and camps of the global refugee crisis. To make his work palatable to a mainstream audience, the star witness must be upheld. But because of the delicate subject matter, this witness must also seem empathetic and willing to get his hands dirty. This is exactly the role I fills here in Human Flow.
کجا برم زندگیمو شروع کنم؟ نمیشه توی اینجا بشینم.
In another scene, about halfway through the film, we are briefly shown an interview with a woman who has her back turned to the camera. Shortly into the interview, she breaks down and waves her hands, signaling to stop. Ai quickly emerges from off-screen and sits down in front of the woman, facing the camera. The director seems very empathetic to her situation, but notably, the camera keeps rolling. The scene continues for a whole nother minute before the gaze is broken. On the subject of a photograph Ai Weiwei staged in which he reenacted an infamous photo of a drowned Syrian toddler washed up on the shore, Marciniak writes, "While it is possible to read Weiwei's image as a powerful instantiation of a politics of mourning and a performance enunciating what Judith Butler calls grievability, predictably the image sparked controversy, and Weiwei's artistic experiment has been called callous, careerist, and even egotistical victim porn." I believe these two interpretations, on near opposite ends from each other, can be applied to scenes like these as well. The discourse around whether Ai filming himself comforting the interviewee with tissues while continuing to film her distress is acceptable to show as the director of a documentary seeking truth, or self-congratulatory and exploitative, seems to be rooted in a central question of authenticity. Why does Ai continue to film, just to see him step in front of the camera to show that he cares? To leave this moment in the film can't help but feel artificial and performative on his part. Human Flow is a fascinating example of how a technically masterful work of film can be completely undermined by a handful of scenes that fundamentally change the impact that film has. Ai Weiwei impresses the viewer with a truly global look at the devastation and trauma refugees are forced to endure. There are moments of impactful documentation of refugee stories, often told autobiographically. However, the filmmaker's own brand as an activist and dissident overshadows what the documentary is trying to accomplish at times. Throughout the film, Ai emulates the visual motif of the news ticker, drawing connections to the only source of representation refugees have been traditionally afforded, TV news coverage. But he does not do much to go beyond the mode of representation Susan Sontag outlines that is so familiar to 24-hour TV news. What Human Flow demonstrates is how traditional documentary modes are insufficient to capture refugee stories. And Ai's added presence seems only intended to make the film more palatable by providing the viewer with a guide or spectator to relate with. The question I return to then is similar to the one Marciniak raises in her piece. How would an artist or documentarian go beyond those limitations and avoid falling into the long tradition of merely documenting suffering outlined by Sontag? Or are there some subjects beyond the scope of representation? Perhaps the experiences of refugees are simply too complex to ever truly do justice to through film, or other media for that matter. Ultimately, however, this just seems like a cheap excuse to just further ignore their suffering.